we've just gotten the full transcripts of the contentious testimony between Michael Cohen and the former president's defense attorneys. They have come out. We should point out that opposing counsel in the hush money trial got a preview of Michael Cohen as a witness back in October when he testified in the former president's civil fraud trial, including how he would handle the credibility issue. This is what he said ahead of that testimony.
My credibility should not be in question. Yes, I pled guilty to a 1001 violation, which was lying to Congress. But I have also requested that people continue the sentence. And the sentence is, I did it at the direction of, in concert with, and for the benefit of Donald J. Trump.
Joining us now with those transcripts is our very own John Berman. So the defense was painting Michael Cohen as a man who hates Trump, is bent on revenge. What are some of the highlights or lowlights?
Well, in this case, I suppose there should be a warning here about language because, it crosses over from PG-13 into rated R here. You spoke a little bit about how Todd Blanche, right out of the gate, said crying little S. Ellie said the word here. About 5 minutes later, he dipped in even more to some greatest hits from Michael Cohen. He's talking about Cohen's TikTok. You also talked on social media during this trial about President Trump, have you not? Michael Cohen says, sounds correct, yes. Blanche says, so for example, on April 23rd, which is after the trial started, correct? Cohen says, yes. You referred to President Trump as dictator D-bag, didn't you? Cohen says, sounds like something I said, which, by the way, is one of the answers he gives very commonly here. Sounds like something I said. Blanche says, and on that same TikTok, so again on April 23rd, you referred to President Trump when he left the courtroom, and you said he goes right into that little cage, which is where he belongs, in an effing little cage like an animal. Do you recall saying that? Cohen says, I recall saying that. And then a few minutes later in the trial, Blanche starts talking about his podcast, Cohen's podcast. Blanche says, you recall the first one in 2020, as a Cheeto-dusted cartoon villain, something he called Trump. Cohen says, that also sounds like something I said. Again, his common response. Now, Blanche says, now, do you recall around that same time, October of 2020, you started talking about your hope that Trump would be convicted of a crime, correct? Cohen says, I don't know if those are the exact words that I said, but the sentiment is correct. You think you might have said, I truly effing hope that this man ends up in prison. Is that exact? Cohen says, it sounds like my language on mea culpa.
The fact that Michael Cohen so obviously and over the top is consumed by hatred for Donald Trump and wants him in prison and celebrating and is selling T-shirts is outrageous. We sort of take it for granted because this has just been Michael Cohen's public persona for the last 5-6 years. But this should be a bonanza for cross-examination. I mean, you, with three former federal prosecutors here, what would you do if you found out the eve of a big trial that your star witness was selling T-shirts showing the defendant in prison? I mean, you'd have to think hard about dismissing the case. That is a major flaw in the defense.
Especially if he's Cheeto dusted.
Yeah.
That would be the
No,
worst.
I mean, you're right. Look, Michael Cohen has a sort of way with words. It can get funny. But, laughing about a defendant going to jail is, I think it's offensive to the jury. That's not for Michael Cohen to say and fantasize about.
That's the worst part of all the things that Cohen has said. It's one thing to say he's terrible, I don't like him, use all sorts of swear words. But if you are talking about the results of this case, I mean, that's what this case is about, whether Donald Trump is eligible to go to prison or not, and you have Cohen campaigning for that, that's a very negative
Blanche
thing about him.
He should have spent the first hour on that.
Well, I mean, I don't think the jury's going to forget it. He spent some time on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also have to remember these jurors are not like we are, right? I mean, they may not be watching everything, prior testimony and stuff that Cohen has said. And so our expectations about how he would perform and what he would do may be a little different than what their expectations are. But he is the crucial witness. I mean, I disagree with you about have they proven the case? Because when I went back to look at the indictment today, and basically they've got to show that he intended to commit another crime, not that he tried to help his campaign. They've got to show that he actually had the intent to commit another crime. And I don't think they've gotten there yet, and that's what they hope they've gotten there with Cohen. But he's got to be the one. And so without that, that's why they're trying to ding his credibility up on, time after time. And whether it's through the comments that he makes on social media, with how he acts on the stand, the wishy-washiness of his answers. I mean, that's what they're after. To say, look, you can't believe him, but don't forget he ran a tape on his client and didn't tell anybody.
Timmy, you believe that they have proved the crime?
Yeah, I think they have. And I think, when you're dealing with a cooperator, what you have to think about is corroboration. Federal prosecutors, all kind of prosecutors, every day they put up murderers, for example, and their cooperators. They put up all kind of people who have done awful, terrible things, much worse than selling T-shirts and wishing that someone goes down. They've tried to kill people. They've killed sometimes the victims in that very case, and juries believe them. Because if you're going to challenge the credibility, you have to place it against a corroboration. And I think that's where the counter-narrative of explaining why is Donald Trump signing these $35,000 checks again and again and again? They're obviously not for legal fees. I don't think that's a reasonable explanation. So I think the Cohen question is going to come down to the corroboration. When the jury goes back and they think about all of these witnesses, they think about these documents, they think about what is a reasonable conclusion here, because it's beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt. And I think that's really the real challenge for the former president here.
But you don't.
Go ahead.
You don't make an axe murderer your cooperator to prove a jaywalking case. And that's sort of where we're at. I mean, they've taken somebody and he's got all this baggage and all this stuff, and he can't keep his mouth shut even during the trial. And they're putting him forward to prove basically a documents case. And I think that may hang with the jury. I agree with you. If you got somebody and you're prosecuting El Chapo and you want to bring in somebody that's cut off heads and sold drugs and carries guns and all that as your cooperator, because that's the one closest to the organization, you may have to do it. Or a member of the Hells Angels or whatever it is. But here, you're using a guy that is so compromised, I think, and they had to spend their whole case trying to prehabilitate him to clean him up. I just
It's
think he's
also the guy who the former president chose to have by his side for 20-something years.
That's actually, I mean, that's the point. When it comes to the optics of how the jury sees this and how they are taking in Michael Cohen, maybe they don't know everything. But, I mean, for everything that Michael Cohen has said about Donald Trump has said about Michael Cohen. They've shown those tweets to the jury as well, where Donald Trump, criticized Michael Cohen for, doing what Paul Manafort did not. The fact that Paul Manafort went to jail and saying that he would not flip, and talking about how Michael Cohen did, and saying no one should retain the legal services of Michael Cohen. Well, Donald Trump did retain the legal services of Michael Cohen for 10 years, and we're talking about payments that he made to Michael Cohen at the heart of this. I also think the other thing that Todd Blanche got into, and I'm sure he'll get more into it, speaking of how much he made off of his books and after the post-presidency or not being in the White House, it's not clear how the jury will take that. It's not like Trump is a normal defendant. While we've talked about Trump's wealth and how it's overstated, he is still a really wealthy person. And so it's not clear that this jury of regular people is seeing, Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels making money as this great sin, counting against them, given Donald Trump's wealth.
John, what more did Cohen say on the stand about Trump's involvement with the payments?
He said it was pretty direct, and this was in the direct examination in the morning where Susan Hoffinger continued what she did yesterday. We have an exchange here about the payments to Stormy Daniels, which was ground they covered yesterday. Hoffinger says, why, in fact, did you pay that money to Stormy Daniels? Cohen says, to ensure that the story would not come out, would not affect Mr. Trump's chances of becoming president of the United States. Hoffinger, if not for the campaign, Mr. Cohen, would you have paid that money to Stormy Daniels? Cohen says, no, ma'am. Todd Blanche issues an objection. The judge overrules it, says you can answer. Cohen says, no, ma'am. Then Hoffinger asked, at whose direction and on whose behalf did you commit that crime? And then Cohen says, on behalf of Mr. Trump. I do wonder if that gets to the point you were bringing up, Michael. We can talk about that in a second. I just want to very quickly say they also got in the direct examination into the Oval Office visit, which is something Caitlin's been talking about for some time, where Cohen says, I was sitting with President Trump and he asked me if I was okay in the Oval Office. He asked me if I needed money. I said, no, all good. He said, because I can get a check. And I said, no. I said, I'm okay. He said, all right, just make sure you deal with Alan, as in Alan Weisselberg. And Hoffinger asks, did he say anything about what would be forthcoming to you? Cohen says, yes, it would be a check for January and February. And then at that point in time, you had not yet been reimbursed for the payments you had made to Stormy Daniels. Cohen says, no, ma'am.
This is a perfect example of what Temadayo and Michael were just talking about. That meeting, the fact that that meeting occurred, is corroborated 5,000 different ways. There's emails, there's texts, there's testimony from Madeline, who was the secretary outside the Oval Office. No question that meeting happened, no question when it happened. But as to what exactly was said, that's really just Michael Cohen's word. And so he is corroborated, but he's not all the way corroborated. The jury, they can't get around the fact that the jury has to put some faith in Michael Cohen's word.
Especially about the purpose of the payments. I mean, that's and that's a very important part of this case, is that, did this money, was it a reimbursement? I think there's a lot of proof about that, but also the records, the business records that are allegedly false, They have to trust Cohen that Trump knew the records were false. That's really on Cohen, and that's a big part of the case.
Berman, thanks very much.